Now we'll move on to the next item, call of bills for final reading. The first one is Bill 23-17, a matter over which council members have great sympathy. Animal control, performance animal violations. The Public Safety Committee recommends enactment with amendments, so I'll turn it to Mr. Elrich.
And I'm going to offer one more amendment, which I think everybody saw, of minor consequence. Basically says that what the agricultural community is doing is not affected by this subsection of the law.
So you move it?
I'll move it.
Second.
Been moved by Mr. Elrich, seconded by Mr. Rice.
So the bill itself, I don't know if I want to ask the sponsors to actually describe what they were trying to achieve. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Elrich. And let me just say that this bill came as a result of the community, as with a lot of our bills. We were at a town hall in Silver Spring, and some residents spoke up about an issue that was of concern to them. And it truly is reflective of responsive government, government that listens to people express concerns and figure out ways to address those concerns. And that's government working at its finest. I will say that, again, this bill has always been, for me, as one of the lead co-sponsors with Councilmember Leventhal, about circus animals. And we've seen, documented, the treatment that animals receive in circuses and in traveling circuses. We know. Zoos will tell you how difficult it is to keep animals in national zoos with some of the best veterinary trainers and all the best treatment that they can come up with for how to protect animals, that it's still a challenge to keep them in confined spaces in those areas. So what do we think happens when you have an animal in a small cage that normally roams free within miles and miles of its natural habitat? What effect does that have? You know, it's interesting because we talk about humans in prisons, and we say, you know, it's no surprise that a human acts the way they do when they're trapped in a cell in a cage, and that they develop different kinds of behavioral patterns. It affects the brain and makes them do different kinds of things as a result. Well, if we are truly animals and evolved, what do we think it does to the animals as well? I think that, again, this is something that's very clear in terms of then why it is that we do it. For the sake of transporting them to one place so that they can, you know, dance on their hind legs with a tutu and somehow say to ourselves that that's the best thing that we can envision for this animal. You know, when I look at where we've gone to as society, and I was joking the other day with my wife, and I said it'll only be a matter of time before, you know, our dogs and cats have their own separate houses within ours. I mean, and it's really one of which, I mean, the love that people have for their pets is immense, and it's great. So where's the love for these wild animals? Because no one would do that to their own dog or cat. No one would subject their dog or cat to the treatment that we see that these wild animals get. No one would take a bull hook to their pet cat and say, I'm going to make Trixie jump through this hoop. Right? We do it with treats. We do it with love. I remember a time when the training for animals used to be that you would have this rolled up newspaper and hit the dog on the nose. And then people realized that wasn't good for them. But yet we take a hook and hit it into an elephant's leg and think that somehow that's okay. And it's not. And it's really not okay for us to continue to have these traveling acts that mistreat animals. And we know it happens. We've seen it documented, and we've seen the results. The results of the mistreatment of animals is that they will act out and then jeopardize the safety of the general public. And that, too, is not what we want. So we have dual-fold responsibility. And so I think that this bill, and I appreciate the folks from our agricultural community who wanted to make sure that we identified this is not about them. And so let me say, this is not about my farming community, my agricultural community. This is about wild animals performing and traveling acts. That's it. And that needs to stop. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. So I just want to observe that we have a motion that has been seconded. We have not yet taken a vote on the motion, and then we'll have the vote on the bill. So, well, that's right. We don't need a motion on the bill, but we have a motion and
On the
and a
amendment.
second on the amendment. So we
Yes.
need to have a show of hands on the amendment, and then, Mr. Leventhal?
I'd like to speak to the bill, but I'd also like to point out that the amendment has a misplaced apostrophe.
There's
So-
no need for animals as
Right.
possessive. It's
So could we,
Yeah.
could I
That's friendly. That's
offer an
friendly.
amendment in the second degree to delete the apostrophe before we vote on the amendment, which I support?
Okay, thank you. Now we'll return to the order that we have.
But I'm a sponsor of the bill also. May I speak to the bill?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll be brief. Mr. Rice spoke very well, and it's been a great pleasure working with Mr. Rice on this. And it's been a pleasure working with the Humane Society of the United States, many of whose leaders are here. I'm in complete agreement with everything that Mr. Rice said. My experience with the leadership in the county of the Humane Society of the United States has been really extraordinarily positive and rewarding, and I have found them to be among the really nicest group of advocates that I've had the opportunity to deal with. When we passed the pet store legislation, we got a lot of thank you notes and really very, very kind comments. And, you know, I've said that serving in elected office in 2017, your ego is more likely to be battered than it is flattered. We're in an incivil time, and the feedback that we get from those who care about animal welfare has been very civil, and even more than civil. I mean, it's been really warm and complimentary, and it's very much appreciated by this council member. And I absolutely support this legislation, for which I served as the lead co-sponsor with Mr. Rice. There just isn't any reason in 2017 why humans ought to rely on the mistreatment of animals for their entertainment. There's a lot of ways to be entertained in 2017, more than ever before. And there are circuses in 2017 which are very, very successful and exciting and interesting and colorful that don't involve the mistreatment of animals. So circuses have changed, and society has changed, and our values and understanding is changing all the time for the better. Like Mr. Rice, I too want to speak to my very good friends in the agricultural community, and there's a number of them here as well. I particularly want to recognize my good friend Marty Severchek and my good friend Jim Clifford, and I'm sorry that we have a disagreement about the merits of this legislation. We have worked very hard to clarify that it does not affect agriculture. It does not affect agricultural livestock. I was delighted to work with agricultural advocates just last week on getting a zoning text amendment on tenant housing. I'm a strong advocate for the mobile agricultural vehicle, which is visiting our elementary schools. There will be many, many more opportunities in the future to continue to support and sustain a thriving agricultural economy in the 1/3 of our county that has been permanently set aside for that purpose. I have always been a champion for agriculture in Montgomery County, and I will continue to be. I really regret that we have a disagreement on the merits of this bill, but there will be many other issues in the future on which I will be your champion and which we'll work closely together. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you particularly, Mr. Rice. It's really been a joy working with you on this.
Thank you. Mr. Hucker, you had your light on, or, okay, you did not. Thank you. Okay, so I think did you have any final comments, Mr. Elrod?
I did want to bring Mr. Koenig up to talk about the one anomaly in the bill, which is the kangaroos. He went out there and did a visit, and I think it'd be appropriate for us to hear, because we're taking something off a wild animal list that was on a wild animal list. I looked at what Australia does, where they have extensive experience with these animals. They have, pretty rigorous rules for how they believe these particular animals need to be treated, including space requirements, and they also consider them wild animals. So I understand that the majority, if not everybody else in the council, is perfectly comfortable making an exemption. I just wanted to give you a chance to tell us what you found or what you think.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this. One of the things I'll say is we had a visit out at the farm that we're talking about, the Ruse to You, and it's met with the owner, and the owner was very gracious, gave us a tour of the facility. I was unable to make it, but I sent 4 staff out there, including a veterinarian and our cruelty investigator, to make sure that if they had any questions or concerns, to bring them back to us. And some of those, I look at challenges. So with the exception that there's certain decisions that would have to look at, especially if they're engaged in commercial activity, and we would have to look at whether or not they would be qualifying under Chapter 5 as a commercial kennel. And if so, looking at the regulations that govern the housing, care, the space and all of that, we're not sure that Chapter 5 is designed to handle or has the wording in there that or provisions to help us regulate or get compliance with a commercial kennel for these particular animals. However, I do believe that there's plenty of information, as Mr. Elrich has referred to. There's plenty of information, and we have resources out there that we'd have to come back with at some point in time to look at that. If it's evaluated to be a commercial kennel, then we'd have to come back and put together some regulatory or some compliance language in there specifically for wild animals or for these wild animals. So it's not an issue that can't be overcome. It's just something that we would have to look at. There were a few other concerns. I've shared them with the owner, and I did get some feedback today with regards to some of them. One of was that in the taming and preparing a kangaroo, for example, for taming or for use as a pet, that the offspring is generally taken from them before they are weaned. So now, just from the sheltering practice and from our view from animal welfare, that practice is discouraged. And the only reason we knew about it is that there was an issue with one of the females that had the recent offspring, and the veterinarian wasn't sure at that time that what the issue was, but it could be related to the removal of the offspring. And what's good about what's going on there is that they do have a veterinarian that's really working with them to kind of help resolve this. Our concern is whether or not this, to make sure that this practice is done humanely, and to make sure that both the offspring and the mother in this case are taken care of. So there was a couple things, and then looking at space, looking at the numbers, looking at that, we'd have to go back and check to make sure that everything's is within industry standards and making sure we're applying those standards.
So I guess my question is, how are you going to do that? Because if we're going to do this, we got to take it seriously. If there's standards of care that need to be applied, this isn't a cat or a dog, it's a different kind of animal. You need to be able to apply that, and you referenced it as being a kennel. It's a breeding facility, right? Or
Yeah,
they do breed the animals.
Yes, they do breed the animals. The primary focus is to grow their stock.
Right.
So, however, they do not keep the male joeys. They do transfer them to what we just found out was to other USDA-approved facilities. So this is a USDA-approved farm. So they have approval to do exhibits and some breeding. I'm not sure of all the details with that, but more importantly, we wanted to make sure that the animals that were transferred out of here were going to a place where it's USDA approved and there's some regulatory. The only question for us is that if they are not a commercial kennel, and the owner has talked to me about this and said that she doesn't have to sell animals. She doesn't have to breed and then sell these animals. That's not an issue for her. The issue really is then there's no other venue right now that I have that would allow us as an agency to regulate or bring them into compliance. It would only be a complaint driven if somebody were to say there wasn't adequate shelter, there wasn't adequate space, water, food, those kind of things, or weren't being provided adequate vet care. So it would be complaint driven. And just so you know that to our knowledge and to the history of this facility, no one's ever complained about this operation. So to my knowledge, that there's no complaints filed. It's just that if they're not commercial, then I don't really have an avenue for regulating or making sure that they're holding to a industry standard compliance. So,
Okay. All right, so, Mr. Katz.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate what you're saying. We actually went out and visited the site as well. First of all, I don't know that it is a commercial kennel. I mean, I don't know that it fits a definition of a commercial kennel. But if it becomes a problem, certainly I would think this body, and in fact the owner, and I certainly can't speak for the owner, she's in the room, but I would think that the owner would want to take care of problems. They love these animals, and because of that, if it becomes a problem, then you should come back and let us know if there needs to be some sort of a change. You know that the facility is there. If you decide that you need to inspect it, whatever, I would think that the owner of the property would want you, the business would want you there. So if this becomes a problem, we should deal with it, but to not allow somebody to do something because there's an if, to me, is not right. So anyhow, I'm certainly supportive of the way that the legislation is written at this time.
Okay.
Okay, we have an amendment before the council. We need a show of hands on the amendment, and it's been amended in the second degree. So let's have a vote on that. This is the amendment.
The amendment is in the addendum packet that was distributed to the council. It's on Circle 1, in writing for you.
It was also distributed by Mr. Eldridge.
Right.
Same thing. Show of hands, please, raise in support on the amendment. Okay, that's unanimous. Now we'll have a roll call vote on the legislation. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Elbridge?
Yes.
Mr. Elbridge votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine? Yes. Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro? Yes. Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous.